Welcome to The Detail. I am your host, Cathy Antunes, and you are listening to The Detail on WSLR 96.5, LPFM in Sarasota, Florida, and WBPV 100.1 LPFM in Bradenton, Florida. The Van Wezel. A year ago, actually, it was last April of 2022, the City Commission approved an agreement with the Sarasota Performing Arts Center Foundation, I believe, to basically begin the process of building a new performing arts hall. But the numbers have been continually questioned, and actually the need for a new building has been continually questioned to the point where, and I'm really looking forward to getting into this with my guest, you've got to wonder how it got this far. My guest today is RONALD KASHDEN. He is a CPA. I call him a financial whiz. And Ron was the auditor for the Shubert Theaters in New York City. RONALD KASHDEN, thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you for having me.
Absolutely. Ron, you're also the president of Laurel Park Neighborhood Association,
I'm
or
on
past?
The board.
Oh, okay.
On the board and the secretary of CCNA.
So you're the secretary of CCNA, which is the Coalition of City Neighborhood Associations. Yes?
Yes.
Okay. Where do we start? I've promoted this as show me the money. Right? Show us the money. The show must go on, but show us the money. And I was, before coming in for this show today, I was asking my husband, he's like my marketing test group of one. But I said, what would you want to know, about this? And his first question was, why do we need a new one?
Yep.
Why do we need a new performing arts hall? And everybody loves new, right? What's not to like about new? But what's being proposed is spending over $400 million, half the money from the city, which would include TIF money, tax increment financing, which has to be approved by the county, and we'll get into that. So it's not just a city project, it's a county project, and the county has to be on board. So $200 million, and let's face it, these projects are always more. Now, whatever the number is, any project in Sarasota that starts out at a number, you got to know it usually winds up 10 to 20% or more higher. So half from the city county, our money, and then half from this foundation. And $400 million to build something a stone's throw from the bay.
Right.
Even though, the Van Wezel's near the water, and they're claiming about, they're talking about flooding, but what they want to build is also near the water, and we're, in a time of rising sea levels. This is what's being proposed, and it's gotten a full court press, actually, for years, without what I would consider any kind of real due diligence. So that's my intro.
Yes.
Where do you want to start, Ron? Tell me about, let's start with, is there anything wrong with the building?
There was a report commissioned by the city manager, Marlon Brown, because he wanted to look into a couple of questions regarding the structure. And he did commission a engineering report, an engineering firm, Karen's, that works with the city quite often, in 2021 to look at the building and both do a cursory look at the structure as well as look into seeing if more seats can be added. And we can get into the question of, one thing that comes up with engineering reports is, what question are they trying to answer? And with this report, in addition to just looking at the building and seeing, are there any structural problems, which they did not find any, they also went on to see what the feasibility is on just a very, very preliminary level of adding more seats. But then the question comes up to, do we need more seats? But yes.
Yeah. So here's the thing, too. So this report was commissioned, I think it was October of 2021.
Yes.
Okay. And so, and it appeared, because at the discussion a year ago, first of all, this is a really foundational, no pun intended, but it makes it, report about whether this building, the Van Wezel, needs to be, scrapped, right?
Yep.
Is it really in bad shape? It's one thing if you're not happy with something, if there's a little water in the basement, but does that mean we need to tear it down? Is it really obsolete? And so that was the point of getting this study, apparently. But when the city was entering into this agreement, and for those of you, before I started paying attention to local politics, I definitely would not have been going into the city website, pulling down the packet for the meeting, and reading the background material. Okay, because, I had a job, I had to put food on the table, I had kids to cart to, baseball and soccer. I wasn't doing that. But there are people in this community who do it, God bless them, and I became one of them, who if there's something happening, and it's not just, obviously, it's not just the citizens, but it's also the press, okay? So the press looks at the packet for the meeting, and they look at the source material. And the bottom line is this report was not available to the public or the press. It was not made public for that huge agreement that the City Commission was discussing. This was April of last year. It was referenced, wasn't that? That's how people got wind that it existed. How did we find out that it existed?
Well, and that's an interesting question and an ongoing problem that I think people within city staff are trying to rectify. But when you bring up the idea of what's in the packet, in that when something gets in front of the city commission, that information is what they use as well to make their decisions. So what was interesting about entering into the agreement with the Sarasota Performing Arts Center Foundation, or the acronym SPAC, which we'll probably use
SPAC,
going on,
right.
There was virtually no background material other than the agreement. And so the city commissioners themselves didn't have access to that information as well.
Which is, because here's the thing. And if you're maybe, again, for people really familiar with city politics, there has been something I've never seen before. Obviously, there can always be some tension between local government and citizens. But we've seen our city manager actually be very aggressive at local meetings in behaving as if, the city government is being unfairly criticized or unfairly held to account. In a matter that's frankly quite shocking to a lot of people. Like, it's too aggressive. And honestly, when you don't provide such a foundational piece of information that we've paid for, let's face it, this engineering report about the Van Wezel is our money, right? If you live in the city, you're paying extra taxes to live in the city for extra services. And you know what that has to include is we get to see these reports. So too bad if you're upset that people are upset with you. The city messed up by not making this report public in a timely way. And I really don't get your hurt feelings that people are upset with you. You messed up. The city messed up on this.
Yep. And what was interesting about that is because there was such little information when the city commission made the decision to enter into the preliminary agreement, which they have no legal obligation to continue. So that's coming up.
So they can bail on this. They can say we're done.
They can say we're done in April. So that is the prerogative of the city commission. But getting back to your point of lack of information, That is what actually got me involved, because I was looking on the financial side and some of the concepts included in the agreement. And that was getting back to our first show.
Yeah.
It just didn't exist. So I started doing the digging.
You're talking with the just basic financial reports and numbers didn't exist for this $400 million project.
Yes. And then what was interesting, following the thread about the Karen's report, is when people started asking questions. And this occurred while there was a city commission election going on. So there were candidates starting to ask questions about both the continued viability of the Van Wezel Hall, as well as whether we need a new SPAC, whether we need a replacement.
New performing arts hall.
Yeah. Exactly. And it was at that point that in response to those questions is when this engineering report first appeared. So up until the point that people started asking, have there been any studies because of the lack of information? That's when the report surfaced.
And that was actually after the city commission voted on the agreement. Okay. So again, this idea like, we're being criticized. Yeah, you are, because this is a big screw up. And so this engineering report became known because there was an election and people are asking questions. It should have been made public, and it should have been able to be reviewed by the entire city commission, the public, and the press. And what does this report say, Ron? It's an engineering report about the status, the state of the Van Wezel.
Exactly.
What does it say?
In a nutshell, what the report did is the engineers, the structural engineers at Karen's, did a overall review of the building, and visibly they found no structural problems with the current building. Then they went on to say, well, what if we try to add X number of seats? How can we expand the building?
And there's how many seats now?
There's 17. It's 1,741 seats.
Okay.
The accountant made me.
1741. Okay. So they were looking at adding more seats because one of the things that the foundation would like is a bigger hall.
Yep.
Is that doable?
There are certain, regarding the Van Wezel, an engineer and an architect could look into adding seats. But where my group came in, because of the lack of information, I started looking at the financials. I got in touch with some engineers that were looking at the engineering, and architects looking at architecture, and theatrical experts looking at the marketing. And what quickly became apparent was there's really no need for additional seats. So that gets back to, what question are you asking?
Right.
Because the way I got to that conclusion is, fortunately, the Van Wezel is owned by the city. So the sunshine laws apply, and we can request information. So we got all the attendance records for the past 10 years, and we looked at the attendance on all the shows. And we found out that over the past 10 years, excluding the shows that were affected by COVID, only 11% of the shows were sold out. So then it comes to, why have more seats? Does that just lead to more vacancy? Does it lead to more empty seats? One of the arguments is this will compete better with the Straz. But even with...
And that's the biggest performing arts hall in the southeast.
Yes,
in Tampa. Okay.
Exactly.
So before we have to be cognizant of the marketplace and competition.
Right.
And so, so they're looking, I think there's some folks advocating for this project, a $400 million, 2,200 seat, new performing arts center, maybe, 200 yards away from the existing Van Wezel, because they want to get better shows, compete with the Straz. Okay.
That's at least the thought behind more seats, that more seats will somehow give us the magic bullet that we can now compete with the Straz. And all the experts would come back and say, no, that's actually a fallacy, in that the Straz would still be bigger than their enlarged venue. And Tampa will always have a larger marketplace than Sarasota. And the Straz and Tampa, in order to protect their profitability, will block out any venue within 90 miles to prevent anyone from cannibalizing their tickets.
Yeah, so that's a concept people need to understand, the whole blackout situation. So tell me more about that.
Yep. So what different cities will vie for various shows that are touring. And Tampa is the largest market, demographic market in our area. And so many times when a first-run touring company will come, they will use their clout as being the largest market and booking that show. And because they're taking on that expense, they will not only black out Sarasota, saying that you can't sell tickets to Sarasota, but it's also Clearwater and St. Pete. They're in the same boat.
So they're basically drawing a circle of like a 90-mile radius around there. And this is typical in the industry.
Absolutely typical.
Because you wouldn't want to book a show and put all kinds of marketing muscle behind it and then know that that show is going to be, 45, 60 miles away, is going to be presented, the following weekend, because you're trying to draw customers. So Tampa's trying to draw customers from Sarasota.
Exactly.
And I've got friends that drive up to the Straz to see, Michael Bublé. And Michael Bublé's come here, but they I don't know, let's say if it was Fleetwood Mac,
right.
The Straz is going to have Fleetwood Mac. They don't want Fleetwood Mac performing on the very next weekend in Sarasota because they won't get those folks filling the seats.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And so that continues on. So the question gets, when it comes up of we should have more seats, one has to ask why, because of these restrictions, because of
the marketplace.
Exactly.
Yeah. Yeah. And so, when it comes to these projects, I always use the example of a hospital cath lab. So, when you're getting your angioplasty, the state actually gives a certificate of need for these facilities. And they do that because we actually need them to be financially viable, right? We need functioning cath labs for human life.
Yes.
This is entertainment, so it's a little different. But for human life, we can't have too many of them being weak and failing, because then when you really need one, you don't have one that functions well. And so you don't have a hub for the same reason. You can't have too many hospitals in the area. You have to actually demonstrate a need. But that standard doesn't exist for concert halls. We're relying on a savvy commission and government and the marketplace. But you can skew that marketplace when you stick public money in, right?
Exactly.
Yeah. And
exactly.
That's, and frankly, that appears to me anyway to be what's happening here.
Yep. And to the listeners, this idea of a market blackout by Tampa isn't something that the citizens came up with. It's not something we generated. It actually goes back to a study that the SPAC Foundation did because they were curious about the market viability if there is a larger hall. And it's their consultants that came to the conclusion that no matter what we build, we will be limited by the Tampa market, not by venue size. And what's interesting about that is when our group started to delve into that, we wanted to independently verify that. So what we did is we looked at every Broadway touring company currently touring in the U.S.
Yeah.
And any show that's not playing in Sarasota is playing at a theater smaller than the Van Wezel. And that, it was because we saw if we're not getting a show that a smaller venue is somewhere in the U.S., then it's not venue size. It's got to be related to our geography.
And the demographics, the market.
Exactly. Exactly. You know, it's not that we're too close to the bay, so we can't get, cats. It's
the show that's going to play in a Venice theater is going to be different than the show that plays in the Van Wezel.
Yep.
Is going to be different than a show that plays in the Straz.
Yep.
Taylor Swift, at the height of her fame, is not coming to the Van Wezel.
Yes.
She's playing in major cities like Tampa, Miami, and Orlando.
Yep.
Period.
Yep.
And that's not about the venue size.
Yep. And I've even heard things like there's been pushback. One of them was, we never got Wicked. Why didn't we get Wicked? If we had a bigger venue, we could get Wicked. And just by doing a bit of research, and this gets back to the lack of information and to some extent the difficulty that the city commission has at making these very complex decisions that they don't have expertise in theatrical.
Well, I think that, let's talk about that, but yeah.
Right. But so when we looked into Wicked, we found out that it had played over in Fort Myers at the Barber Man.
Mm-hmm. And is that a comparable size?
It is a very comparable size.
Okay.
So
there was some other factor. It wasn't the venue size.
It had nothing to do with the venue size.
Would it be the quality of the venue? Is there some quality issue that you've come across?
Well, and that is interesting because we had asked that. Because then the question comes, is there some characteristic of the Van Wezel that would limit our shows? And we came up with two instances in all the history, over the 50 years that we delved into the Van Wezel. One was Phantom of the Opera. And the touring company had decided that it was too difficult to attach the chandelier that falls so dramatically in that show to our roof.
I see.
So that was one show because of the chandelier in the particular of the Phantom. The other one that we originally had problems with is Lion King. And anyone that's seen Lion King, the opening act is extraordinary, where all these animals come marching down the aisles.
Yeah.
Well, anyone that's been to the Van Wezel knows with the continental seating, we don't have a center aisle. So how do you march the animals? And for years, they had thought about that. But if we've had the Lion King. It's been a wild success. And what they ended up doing is just a minor modification where they were able to march the puppeteers down the sides. And so they were able to solve that. And so those are the only two shows that there were some aspects.
Some technical issue.
Exactly.
Yeah.
If some, one of the typical things that I hear or that the group hears is, if we had a larger venue, we could have gotten Hamilton. Well, anyone that has seen Hamilton knows there are no technical complications that the Van Wezel could and it could easily support. So a new venue wouldn't change that.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. Well, this began this new performing arts center. I was back in 2014 because this is an adjunct of the Bay, the project, the Bay.
Yes.
And so the Bay is really makes sense to me that all the surface parking for the Van Wezel is bayfront parking.
Yep.
And that truly is not the wisest use of waterfront property is, surface parking.
Agreed.
And so to transform it into a park, right? And even, with sea level rise too, to soften our shorelines so that they can absorb sea level rise and harden our buildings or move our buildings, it does make sense. But in 2014, what I've observed, and I'm curious to know if you say this is accurate, is this has been talked about, a new performing arts hall. They make very nice renderings, artistic imaging of this new performing arts hall. And they talked about it, and they would give some numbers that even back in 2014 raised my alarm bells. Like, that's a lot of money.
Yes.
Now it's $400 million. But I never heard any specifics. It was almost like, well, we've drawn this picture, so that must mean we've committed to it since 2014. And my response is, actually, I don't think that's right. It seems to me that all you've done is draw a picture, and so you've been creating this expectation or story that this was decided back then. And actually, the only real decision that was made was last April in 2022, which didn't have this engineering report and other information.
Absolutely. And it's funny, the history of the SPAC is kind of fascinating in how it evolved.
So and SPAC means New Performing Arts.
Oh, sorry.
Okay.
I'll say the New Performing Arts Center so no one has to remember an acronym. Back in 2000, they expanded, they made the stage house much, much taller to support the new Broadway touring shows that are coming with more complex sets. And that was great for the Broadway shows. But that altered the acoustics of the hall. And a little after that time, when they were struggling because the orchestra is one of the major users currently of the Van Wezel. Mm-hmm. And the orchestra, of course, cares deeply about the sound. So they had to figure out with movable shells and try and mitigate the improvements that they did for the Broadway shows.
Because that was bad for their music, right?
Exactly.
The acoustics are not good for a symphony. They just aren't. Yeah.
And they wanted more capacity as well.
Okay.
So with that, the orchestra started to explore, maybe we need our own hall, because this hall, while it's good for variety acts, great for Broadway, doesn't quite work for the orchestra.
Classical music.
Exactly.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
So that's where the kernel of we need a new hall began. And for a while, the orchestra was thinking about putting their new hall right next to the existing Van Wezel. Mm-hmm. But as we know, the orchestra had decided at the end that they're going to Fruitville.
Yeah.
So the reason for the new hall went away when the orchestra moved to Fruitville. But this idea of a new hall, this kind of zombie, lingered on. Mm-hmm. And that's where we end up here. When people start questioning, well, why are we even talking about this? They forget the history of, where it began.
Yeah. Yeah. Everyone, if you're just joining us, you are listening to The Detail on WSLR 96.5, LPFM in Sarasota, Florida, and WBPV 100.1 LPFM in Bradenton, Florida. The Sarasota County Extension Office is offering a class about Sarasota County's native plants, their benefits, and how best to incorporate them into your landscape. This class will be held on Monday, March 6th from 10 a.m. to 11 a.m. Registration and more information is available online at ufsarasotaext.eventbrite.com or by phone at 941-861-5000. My guest is RONALD KASHDEN. He's a CPA and was the auditor of the Shubert Theaters in New York City. He's also serves on his neighborhood association board. And Ron and your wife, Kelly Franklin, have been just exploring and gathering information about the plan to build a new performing arts hall. So, Ron, I've been paying attention locally closely since 2008. There's so much that goes on. I would never claim to, there's always more to know. There's a lot actually with local government. But when I compare what's being proposed for this performing arts hall, $400 million, half from local government, the county and the city, tax increment financing money is not just city money, it's also county money. So $200 million of public money, $200 million from the foundation, and I want to get into the private fundraising question. But when you compare that number with any other project that's been done for recreation or art, so, when you compare it to Ed Smith Stadium, and that wound out to be $32.5 million to improve, Ed Smith. And there's been more money put in since then. But when you look at extending the Legacy Trail, which had to be approved by voters. The county requires in our county charter that beyond around 20 million, the voters have to approve it. So 20 million for Legacy Trail that got approved. The rowing facility wound up being like 50 at the end of the day, using state money as well as local money. This is so much more money than anything. I mean, this is 20 Legacy Trails. This is like 10 stadium refurbishments. And I'm being conservative. And the thing about all those projects, Ron, is they always wind up being more. So if they start out at 400, you got to figure maybe 450 by the end.
Yep.
Have you looked at that at all? Like, this is just monumentally more than anything we've ever done before. And is that wise?
Absolutely. And this will be, no matter where it comes in, because the foundation has, although they haven't changed their specifications, keep on publicizing less and less costs. And when it originally was approved, Commissioner Brody had made the comment of, guys, let's expect it. It's not going to be 300 that the foundation's talking about. It's going to be exactly as you say, 4 or 5 or maybe more. And when you think about the amount of discussion that was had both in the city and the county just for Bobby Jones, it really hasn't risen to that level. And what was interesting, you had brought up earlier that this is not just a city approval, but because it involves the TIF district, it also has to get approved by the county. And when we reached out to the county, all those commissioners view this as a wild extravagance. They are not on board in the least bit. We had one commissioner, and I can't quote verbatim what was said, but it was clear that this was not going to happen.
It'd be one thing if we didn't have a functioning performing arts hall.
Yes.
Okay, but we do. And we have an engineering report saying that it functions, that it doesn't need to be replaced. I could see why if we didn't have one, that it might make sense to invest at this level. Building Riverview High School, and that was controversial because the old high school had some architectural value. That was $100 million.
Yeah.
This is 4 to 5 times that.
Yes.
It's like, wow.
Yep.
Let me ask you this. Well, I'll ask you this, but if you want to go back, we can. From a donor perspective, I had heard that there was a donor, people with this kind of money obviously want to be careful. Many of them want to be very careful that their money is being used wisely. And I've heard that donors, when they understand the magnitude of the spend right near the bay during sea level rise, that there's very good reason to believe that putting something like that right next to the water is unwise, and that these venues should be moved inland. Is there any validity to that? Have you heard that as well? Like, donors are looking at them. The private fundraising piece is so huge, $200 million. will donors be turned off?
Yep. And that brings up two really good points. First off, on our group, where we had people trying to do the due diligence that it seems that the foundation hasn't done. One of them being an architect, the other one being structural engineer, looked into the flood proofing of the Van Wezel. And it can actually be done for a fraction of the cost to actually handle it for a storm surge, if you want to protect it for a hurricane. But when you get back to the donor problem and the questions that the normal philanthropic community would have, we've actually gotten some of the members of the board on the foundation, on the SPAC Foundation, leave the foundation because of their disgust at the lack of information, the lack of due diligence, the lack of study that has gone into this effort. So you are absolutely right. People, big pocket donors that would normally absolutely give to this project are not only questioning it, but actually withdrawing from the foundation. I was surprised to hear board members leaving the foundation because of this issue. And it's not because of the idea, it's because the foundation itself hasn't done the necessary investigation and analysis that such a large project would go into.
Yeah.
And what's interesting about that is coming up on April 4th, the foundation is going to ask for a renewal, an extension of this preliminary agreement because they still haven't done all the studies necessary. So you're absolutely right bringing that up.
Yeah. One of the restraints in that April agreement of 2022, which is now up for renewal or revision, it will expire.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay, so it's due to expire, honestly, for me, thank God, because we need these questions answered. We need a better bird's eye view of what's happening here. But that agreement and the new Performing Arts Foundation, I'm not going to use the acronym so everybody knows, it's the people who want a new hall, and they want to put, the purple cow out to pasture, the Van Wezel. Their agreement requires that the Van Wezel not compete. So what they want the city to accept, and city taxpayers and county taxpayers to accept, is we have a building that's not at the end of its useful life, okay? We have a building that can go another 20, 30 years at least, if it's cared for. And while there might have been a bit of neglect, this thing is, she's a hardy cow here. She's going to keep going.
According to the engineers.
Yeah. But what they want to do is hamstring the city and say, no, you can't have anything in that hall just 200 yards away, right? We want you to give us $200 million. We want to build this new hall. We say we're going to bring another $2 million, which a lot of us wonder if they have the chops and the capacity to raise that kind of money. But you can't use this other hall for anything that we might want to do in the new hall. What does that do? What kind of impact does that have on? Because doesn't that kind of doom the building to fall into neglect, disrepair, and just you might as well knock it down? I mean,
that seems to be the logical conclusion, because you're absolutely right that the agreement says the Van Wezel cannot compete in any way with the new Performing Arts Center. And what's interesting about that, if you even think of, so no shows, whatever use that's the Van Wezel could do in the future, if it impacts or competes in any way with the new venue, they're not allowed. Yeah. And with the new venue, the city did a parking study, because you had brought up that they want to use more of the existing parking lot for park space, green space, which makes sense. But that means there's going to have to be a off-site parking garage because
So another expensive building. Yeah.
the city commissioned their own parking study, and they found that using the specs for this new building, there's going to be 500 parking spots that are going to need to be filled outside of this area. And so one can question that even if you find some esoteric use for the Van Wezel, if someone needs to park in order to get to that esoteric use, is that competing? You know, if you don't have enough parking spots to begin with for the shows that are presenting in the newer area, if someone can't get a parking spot because they're going to the Van Wezel, is that now a limited use?
Yeah. So, you know, from the market perspective and competing with other cities for big shows, when you look at the data, we've touched on that, we talked about that, this really doesn't make sense. The building is sound. It's got a lot of useful life. And if you're looking at this from a portfolio of city infrastructure investments, you know, and maxing out your investment, this doesn't make sense.
Yep.
Let's talk a little bit about their ability to bring the $200 million. I really question the foundation's ability because right now what I've read, and it's been a while, is that maybe they have 20 and they haven't even shown that they have the money to do this.
And the 20 is kind of interesting. So they're publicly, the foundation has said that they've received $20 million worth of donations. 10 of it came from a former circus star. But that money was done when they were soliciting as the Van Wezel Foundation. So there's questions to...
Is it even theirs?
Yes. You know, what was the purpose of that $10 million? But recently, there was an announcement that the foundation did receive $10 million. So now they have $20 million committed.
Which is 1/10 of a number that is going to get bigger if you're prudent when it comes to construction. Yeah. And so I guess my question would be, if I were sitting on that city commission, I would be saying, you got to bring a lot more than that before I'm going to commit $200 million of taxpayer dollars. And you're telling me you have 10% of the nut, the part of the nut that you're required to bring. Why? Because it's been since 2014 that they've had to raise money. That's 8 years, now 9 years. So if you haven't raised more than $20 million in 9 years, why would I have any confidence or belief in reality, reasonable belief, that you're going to bring the remaining $180 million in a couple, what's going on with that?
Right. And you're talking about a construction property. So it's not that the foundation can raise this money over the next 10, 15 years. When that construction begins, when shovels hit the ground, you've got to have that bucket of money, at hand to pay for the construction. So the burden for the foundation, as well as the city and the county, is they have to have all the money up front. And so you're absolutely right.
And there's no indication that now, of course, the public, there's ways, but that the public can bring forward that kind of money. But I've got to wonder, why in the world would you even take this seriously if you've got a foundation that's raised only 1/10 of the money needed in 9 years?
Yep. And this will be a city-owned building. So if the foundation can't raise the money, we're on the hook.
Yeah, and I almost wonder, is that the plan? Are you trying to back the city and the county into a corner so that you're going to bring just a little bit and then you're going to, we couldn't do it, but we have to keep building. And then the public's going to be on the hook for $350 million or $400 million?
It gets back to the due diligence.
Yeah.
Why is this organization pushing so hard and so quickly? Have they done it in the wrong order? They really should do their prep first before coming.
Yeah. So just to step back some, because I think in a lot of ways. And here's the thing. Everyone's a nice guy. All the people who are involved in this, they kiss their kids at night. Yep. They love their grandchildren. We're not here to say you're a bad guy, right?
No, not at all.
Okay. So that's a given. Now, where is the sense of propriety toward the community? Because in Sarasota, there's this culture of demeaning people who have the audacity to ask questions, right? About reasonable questions about a project or about a policy. And we have, I think, having watched it now for a while, a very unfortunate, and you've seen it with the city manager going to CCNA, and this is somebody we all pay, and taking a very aggressive stance in maligning the citizens, frankly, he's supposed to be serving, and okay, maybe he had a bad day, but it wasn't the only time we've seen this tone, and this tone of rancor toward the public that ask questions has actually gotten worse. I look at this and go, when are we going to require, when is it going to be accepted that putting forward fantasies is a disservice to your neighbors? Like, there is a problem with people putting forward a pretty idea and leading people along and acting as if it's reality when they're not doing anything to actually put it in reality and do the due diligence. At what point does the people in the community go, we've had enough of this. This is really not fair.
Yeah. And that actually, to be frank, was the biggest surprise of this entire journey that I've had exploring the Van Wezel, insofar as it is delightful to see intelligent, engaged discussion on a topic. Mm-hmm. And that is the attitude I felt going into this, that questions would be raised and they would be answered, or at the very least discussed. And what really surprised me was every time we raised a question of, the Karen's report says this is stable.
Which is the engineering report.
The engineering report says it's stable. What are we missing? We didn't get a response of we're missing XYZ, or you need to take a look at this, or that's a good question, we need to explore it. The pushback came from you don't own the facts, or, there's misinformation out here, but without explaining what is that misinformation? What part of this? We are just reading reports that either are commissioned by the city or commissioned by the foundation. Where is the misinformation? And I agree with you. That was the biggest surprise.
Well, it's like the best defense is a good offense. We're not actually going to deal in reality and acknowledge this is a reasonable question and then come back and answer the question. We're going to posture that, how dare you ask this question? And of course this makes sense. It's, the emperor has no clothes all day long, and we want you to act like he does. It's very disrespectful.
I agree. And get back to your comments that you made earlier, that and to all the listeners out there, there's never a time that we say anyone is a bad person, or but that seems to be the response that we're getting regarding just asking questions for the largest project that the city has ever considered to undertake.
Yeah, this whole political environment of the past, 10 years that we're dealing with, it's very contentious. But, the word snowflake is used. And I think it's a projection often that, in this regard, why would people putting forward such an ambitious project with so much public money being requested have frankly, snowflake reactions to accountability.
Yep.
Snowflake reactions to, how dare you ask me to explain, why the structure is failing, or how dare you ask me to explain why this is needed. They simply want to ignore huge basic chunks of reality and keep talking about how this building is going to happen.
Yep.
So I would love to see perhaps this is the discussion that can change the tenor of our political culture in the city and the county. Like, yeah, we have to deal with reality and we need to welcome people who ask reasonable questions. We're not all going to agree, but we need to be able to agree on facts.
Yep. Or at least have the conversation regarding that. And at one point, the foundation actually reached out to neighborhoods saying that we're going to show you all we've done and the progress. And just recently, we found out that they've pulled back from those presentations, that they're not in a position to answer any of the questions that the public has. We're still trying to just disseminate the information that the city and the foundation have created, that they've commissioned and paid for. We're just waiting to hear about the studies that the foundation has done or that the city has done.
Mm-hmm. So essentially, there was going to be an information tour going to neighborhood associations with the New Performing Arts Foundation and them explaining the work that they had done and where they were. And then you as well saying, these are the questions people have. This is the work we've done. And it sounds like they just bailed. They're not showing up.
They're just not showing up. They've canceled all their engagements. And one has to ask, if they're so close to breaking ground for committing the city to potentially hundreds and hundreds of millions of dollars, you should be able to at least have a discussion of the purpose and the rationale. Mm-hmm. And that just seems to be missing.
Yeah. Ron, we have a few minutes left. What do you think? First of all, there's a website, right?
Yes.
What is the website
it's
for your?
keepthevanwezel.com.
Okay. Which begs my next question. What do you see as the optimal outcome, to these discussions about Sarasota's Performing Arts Hall?
Yeah, I think that the studies that should have been done before this agreement was entered into should be undertaken. And the city seems to have begun to pivot with a committee that they were required to set up. They term it a Blue Ribbon Committee. Mm-hmm. And this Blue Ribbon Committee, this panel, can do the investigation into the existing fully functioning Van Wezel Hall to see, is there any additional issues regarding this? What would be the costs to flood-proof it, to storm-proof it, to possibly change the seats? A lot of people, and rightfully so, complain that the seats that, the original seats in the hall were changed in around 2010 for the existing seats, and they're tight. So
they were nicer before?
They allowed for more room. Mm-hmm. Exactly.
Okay.
But all the questions that should have been raised, do we need more seats? What would more seats provide us? Can we get additional shows? All the renovation and deferred maintenance that should have gone into the building. We can answer all those questions, and that should be done before any discussion of any legal agreements or moving forward. Yeah. We should first take a look at the gem that we have right now, because people should remember that this hall was actually designed by the son-in-law of Frank Lloyd Wright, who was Frank Lloyd Wright's number one protege. They referred to him as, pun intended, his right-hand man.
And this is Taliesin, so it was Frank Lloyd Wright's architectural studio. There is a architectural history here that is unique. It has, Van Wezel's been voted one of the best performing arts halls, gotten that award in 2020 from their own industry. Ron Kashden, I want to thank you so much.
Thank you for having me.
Absolutely. We'll continue to follow this. I think we've talked about it every 3 or 6 months just to keep people informed. But it'll be April when the City Commission looks again.
It comes back, I think, April 4th or
April
the
4th.
Beginning of April.
Okay, so we'll remind people. And everyone, you've been listening to The Detail on WSLR 96.5 LPFM in Sarasota, Florida, and WBPV 100.1 LPFM in Bradenton, Florida. And the Sarasota County Extension Office is offering a class about Sarasota County's native plants, their benefits, and how best to incorporate them into your landscape. This class will be held this coming Monday, March 6th, from 10 a.m. to 11 a.m. You can register and get more information online at ufsarasotaext.eventbrite.com. or by phone at 941-861-5000. Thank you all so much for listening. Be sure to stay tuned for more public affairs programming here on WSLR. Make it a great day.